I am 17.
16.
I'm 17 years old.
I'm 14 years old.
I'm 16.
14.
I'm 14.
What have we been doing in Afghanistan this whole time?
That's a great question. I have no clue.
I don't entirely know.
I really couldn't tell you.
You know, I really don't know that much about it.
I think we've been trying to help out, but I don't know that much about it.
With like the Taliban, I'm not really sure.
I don't know. I feel like I just haven't really heard that much about it.
America's longest war. The conflict in Afghanistan has stretched over decades now, going on so long that the entire generation of Americans under 20 years old have never known a time when America wasn't at war. Despite the conflict running across the pond for years, the details of the war elude most Americans. A public ignorance of why we've been in Afghanistan results from a lack of transparency and perhaps a change in American motives.
Basically, what we are doing is that we just blame the war on the corruption and the incapability of the Afghans.
So let's get to the root of the question. What have we been doing there all this time? And have we been there for the right reasons? It is impossible to look at Afghanistan's history as existing only after the U.S. declared war upon the attack on the Twin Towers in 2001. American influences have shaped Afghanistan since the 70s, nearly 50 years. The history of Afghanistan is fraught with struggles against foreign powers and an inability to form an effective government. In 1973, the Afghan Communist Party overthrew the king in a coup. The party was successful at first, but their secular beliefs faltered amongst Afghanistan's traditional culture. They became the first in a long line of groups who tried and failed to control Afghanistan. In 1979, the middle of the Cold War, the USSR invaded Afghanistan. Opposing this occupation, the CIA funded a guerrilla group called the Mujahideen to defend against the Soviets. Armed and trained by the CIA, those rebels would eventually turn on the Americans and become the modern-day Taliban. But at that moment, they were allied with the US over their hatred of the Soviet Union. The Taliban began their rise in 1995. The years of drought, famine, and internal state fighting had exhausted the Afghan citizens. The Taliban took over public resources, using them to enforce incredibly restrictive laws, specifically on women. Islamic law was carried out with amputations and public executions. Though the U.S. refused to recognize them, by then the Taliban had control over nearly the entire country. Tensions had been rising for years between former allies after the Soviets withdrew. Then, the unthinkable happened. America was attacked on September 11, 2001, and 2,977 American citizens were killed.
You guys are probably not even born 20 years ago, but I mean, that was a really huge turning point for the American psyche.
President Bush appeared on the airwaves within 24 hours.
There is no neutral ground. If any government sponsors the outlaws and killers of innocents, they have become outlaws and murderers themselves.
Congress voted almost unanimously in favor of full military force, with a singular vote in opposition.
Some of us must say, let's step back for a moment. Let's just pause just for a minute and think through the implications of our actions today so that this does not spiral out of control.
We quickly got into Afghanistan instead of really patiently exhausting all possible diplomatic means.
In a flurry of airstrikes and raids, the Taliban crumbled within 2 months of the first U.S. strike. By December 22, 2001, the U.S. had sworn in a new pro-Western leader. The country was declared Taliban-free. But in 2003, the Iraq War diverted America's attention from Afghanistan, allowing the Taliban to take advantage. Elections occurred in 2005, but the Afghan government was fragile and vulnerable to corruption.
You know, this is not a forum in which you can have good governance. It's not a forum where the degree to which corruption was tolerated. You cannot create peace when that level of corruption is just ignored. And it was phenomenal levels of corruption.
Our military commanders warned that we could face a resurgent al-Qaeda and a Taliban taking over large parts of Afghanistan. For this reason, in one of the most difficult decisions that I've made as president, I ordered an additional 30,000 American troops into Afghanistan.
By 2006, the Taliban was back with a vengeance, launching one of the bloodiest terrorist campaigns in history all over Afghanistan. Suicide bombers targeted the capital. The U.S. poured $15 billion into the country to combat the staggering levels of corruption in the Afghan government.
This was a free-for-all for many people, and the voices that we did not hear were the average Afghans.
The U.S. bolstered the Afghan government with 17,000 more troops, but the war, now in its 7th official year, had racked up a civilian casualty count that made it vastly unpopular back in the U.S.
Civilians should never be a target in a war. That just is not allowable. Civilians are not the people who are engaged in combat.
Upon Osama bin Laden's capture in 2011, the public was ecstatic and then wondered why tens of thousands of troops remained in Afghanistan. Retribution no longer seemed an acceptable reason to still be fighting. At that point, the U.S. had been there for a full decade, and there was no end in sight.
Osama bin Laden was gone. That was 10 years ago. Think about that. We delivered justice to bin Laden a decade ago, and we've stayed in Afghanistan for a decade since.
In the 2010s, leaders began taking action to withdraw. Thousands of U.S. troops remained in Afghanistan after this deadline, however, and there didn't seem to be an urgency to pull them out. President Trump negotiated a U.S. withdrawal with the Taliban in 2019. Setbacks included the death of an American soldier, after which peace talks were called off, but plans to withdraw troops continued regardless. The Taliban grew in power, gaining territory. Inside cities, U.S. control weakened as the soft targets were violently attacked: mosques, maternity wards, universities, and even high schoolers taking college exams.
I'm now the 4th United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th.
The withdrawal was chaotic and rushed, alarming the Afghan people. U.S. troops were flown out in cargo planes, leaving Afghan citizens and army personnel vulnerable to the Taliban. By August 15, 2021, the Taliban had resumed complete control of the capital. Hope for Afghans faded as the Taliban cemented their rule.
The goal that we seek is achievable and can be expressed simply. No safe haven from which al-Qaeda or its affiliates can launch attacks against our homeland or our allies.
Over time, our motives evolved as we took upon ourselves the perhaps unnecessary burden of creating and supporting an Afghan government strong enough to keep the Taliban at bay.
But the way that we did it made it pretty much impossible for them to win that. It was not something that you pull out all the logistical support right away. You don't look at, making sure that the military that we spent so much time, effort, and money to create was being properly managed. Again, it's not ours to manage anymore, but we should have had the foresight to see that that was not sustainable.
However, taking over Afghanistan seemingly as a project didn't quite have the effects it was intended to have.
We invested a lot in the country and its infrastructure, its government, and the whole range. There were lots of contractors and people, but what they never got right was this has to be about the well-being of the Afghan people, and the Afghan people had very little say.
We sent them a lot of military advisors and the troops to train the Afghan police, all under the purpose of, making the war Afghan war, right? Not our war. But actually, in the process of doing so, we basically came to own the war.
America ended up spending just shy of 2 decades fighting the Taliban for the Afghan army, instating leaders, and using Afghanistan's land to build and expand in a way that made sense to America, not to the Afghan people.
The way how we tried to help them actually made these Afghan partners fatally dependent on the continuous flow of resources and power supplied by us.
Despite the exploitation and corruption running rampant, the U.S. decided to withdraw and leave the Afghan people under the rule of a weak, corrupt government that was always doomed to fail. To fight for 20 years and then just withdraw for the Taliban to retake control. Many citizens argue that justice was not served for those who died, and that this military endeavor has been a tragic end to futile fighting. Comparisons to Vietnam have sparked ever since the withdrawal, with people remarking that the war killed thousands in exchange for little real progress. Whether or not this war was a just one is up to the interpretation of the individual, but what is inarguable is that such a conflict should never again be repeated.